You are now listening to theGrio's Black Podcast Network, Black Culture Amplified.
Hello and welcome to Writing Black here at theGrio Black Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Maiysha. And this month at theGrio, we're doing something really exciting called Africa Amplified, where we are magnifying the voices, perspectives, and stories of the African diaspora. And I'm really excited that we have an incredible novelist with us today. Her name is Ayobami Adebayo. She is the author of 2 books, the first of which, Stay With Me, was an acclaimed debut on many best book lists, and it has been translated into multiple languages, and now she's back with a new one called A Spell of Good Things. This is out on February 7th. Another incredible, sprawling work of fiction with fascinating characters and intersecting narratives, and I'm so excited to have Ayobami here today to talk to us about this book and about how her culture is informing her work, because that's what we do here at Writing Black. So Ayobami, welcome to Writing Black. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Maiysha. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I love this book. I'm enthralled by it for several reasons, but mainly because I think it's giving a lot of us, as an American reader, who has not spent the time I would like to spend in West Africa yet and has not been to Nigeria, it to me is a really exciting lens into that culture, the kind of not just the traditions, but the class struggles. Tell me about the origin of this story, which it's a sprawling one. I mean, we've got over 352 pages, I think, we're about the copy I have. So this is not a short book. You really dig in and you really spend time with these characters, and there's a lot of them. So tell me about how you dug into this.
Thank you so much. So I began thinking about it at some point, I think either late 2012 or early 2013. So that's about 10 years ago now. Yeah. It takes me a while to finish these things. But it was something that happened to me, really, that I was coming back from work in the city that I'd lived in since I was about 8 years old. And because there was traffic, we had to take a detour. And I ended up in this neighborhood that was quite impoverished and at the same time unrecognizable to me. And I was in my mid-20s at the time, and I really started thinking about how I'd been blind to this reality. How could I have lived in this place for this long and I'd never seen this? So I think I carried that thought with me for about a year or two before I then started working on the novel, before I knew that this form was one of the ways in which I would think through some of the questions that I had started asking of myself after that moment. So that's how I started writing this book.
And you bring us right into that world. That, I mean, your book opens there. It takes us many other places, but it opens there with a family who's really struggling, a child really of a family who's really struggling, and he becomes this vehicle, I think, for understanding not just poverty and how it functions, but how close all of us teeter to that reality, right? Like, his vulnerability, his struggles, his the things that his parents are grappling with, because you're also really dealing with there's a discussion of depression here. And I think there's a humanizing that you're doing with this family that's really striking, or to me was incredibly striking.
On his way back, he would pass by this vendor's stand, flipping through the newspaper so that this wicked man could see. But before all that could happen, his father had to find the right job vacancy, and so Eniola took the newspaper, mumbling something that could be mistaken for a thank you, and began to run. away from the vendor and his smelling mouth.
In terms of trying to articulate this existence that obviously was not your own, at least from what you just said there, how did you go into kind of teasing out that humanity from this family?
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. So with this book, and I think with any other thing I'm writing or I'm going into, particularly when it's fiction, I can begin with an idea, but I don't start until I feel like I know the people, or I feel like I have a person that I'm interested in and that I get to know over the period of a few years. So this novel, there are like 9 perspectives in it. But it begins with this young boy for me. He is really the heart of the novel for me. And I didn't feel confident that I had a book until I really knew him. And for me, that process is the first thing about that process is that it takes forever. It takes so much time. But it's one that I really enjoy because I do feel like I'm discovering a person. And sometimes what that looks like is that I sit with them and ask them questions, about their life, about what they're interested in, about what their aspirations are. So sometimes I have these sessions where I ask like 20 questions. I do like 20 questions for the character. And even though a lot of it never makes it into the novel, I feel that it's very important because it gives me, when I'm writing, a sense of clarity about who I'm creating. And I think that translates to the reader, that there's more that you know about the character than is even necessary for the page. So with him, part of it was sitting with him and answering those questions and understanding him, and also the time that he was living in, and the community that he's in. All of that, comes together in forming the character. So particularly when it's very distant from my own personal experience, I really want to take that time and be very careful, and to make sure that I'm really writing a human being.
I love that idea of 20 questions. I think, and that idea of character development. I'm so, we started this podcast to talk about, not just what Black writers write about, but how. And so I think that's such an incredible piece of process to share with our listeners. And I want to talk more about these characters in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more Writing Black. All right, we are back with Ayobami Adebayo, and we are talking about her new book, A Spell of Good Things. One of the things that really, really struck me in this narrative, obviously we are starting with this child, we are starting with this specific neighborhood and the people within it who don't have a lot of money, but we're also, you span a society in this book, and we're really talking about different socioeconomic classes and experiences and expectations. But expectations, these familial expectations and obligations and traditions, it permeates kind of every level of, no matter who you're talking about, you're seeing these people kind of butting their heads up against whoever it is they're expected to be, or at least that's how it translated to me. Was that like a very deliberate theme that you were trying to tease out here? Or would you say it's kind of more of a broader cultural commentary? Like how did that factor in for you as you were kind of building out this story and these stories within the story?
Thank you. I would say that it's very deliberate. It's a very Nigerian novel, and it's something that I think is in the water in many Nigerian communities and families, whether in Nigeria or in the diaspora, that there are very specific expectations, And I'm always curious for me about the people who choose not to meet those expectations or who cannot meet those expectations. Um, or the moment where people realize, well, maybe I'm not interested in being this person that everybody wants me to be. So I think that that's something that I'm always interested in when I'm writing about many Nigerian communities or a Nigerian family, that I'm looking at that tension and how people manage that. Because I think it's very complex, particularly when they're familial, just because of how intimate the relationships are. And they can be claustrophobic, they can be suffocating the people that they love, So people can end up really suffocating other people in the name of love and affection and wanting the best for them.
I mean, absolutely. What's the meaning behind tell us about the title, A Spell of Good Things.
Yeah. So there's a novel that I really love by another Nigerian writer called Everything Good Will Come. So I wanted something that paid homage to that book as a title. So I worked with a number of options of good things. But at the heart of it is really one of the characters who is one of the people I really like in the novel, was one of the mothers, and just her own attitude, how she's aware of how fragile everything is. She's aware of the fragility of a good fortune, in life. She's very fortunate, she's very aware of it. But she's also very aware that it can all change in a minute. And so that's where the title comes from.
I love that sentiment, and I think I know which character you're talking about, and I love her. We're going to talk more about A Spell of Good Things in just a moment when we come back with more Writing Black. All right, we are back with Writing Black and with Ayobami Adebayo, whose book, A Spell of Good Things, comes out on February 7th. This is her second novel. And I love that you described it as a very Nigerian novel. I thought that was actually really cool. I'm a longtime reader, literature lover. I mean, that's why I started this podcast. And I remember, growing up studying literature, you'd maybe get tossed a handful of writers from the diaspora, right? And maybe a couple of West African writers, maybe you'll get a Chebe or maybe you'll read The Joys of Motherhood, which I know you also mentioned in this book. But one of the things that's been so exciting to me about the last decade, maybe a little more, is that we've really seen this huge influx of writers from across the diaspora. And I think especially a lot of West African writers as well, really making their way, their work making their way to American readers, and us getting a real chance to hear these firsthand narratives, whether they're fictional or not. And I think, those of us who can trace our origins back to West Africa, I think can be very special to have a better sense of connection other than, how we translate things here in America, how we, because I think, for an American, you sit and you think, oh, Nigeria, what you might know is like, maybe I have a Nigerian American friend or a first gen friend. And so we hear about the demands that you were just discussing from a different perspective, like, oh, there's this expectation of success. There's this expectation that you do these certain things. And we have our own version of that, obviously, but it's so, I think, poignant and beautifully illustrated in A Spell of Good Things. I think the way that you are, it's nuanced. It's a nuanced conversation, maybe is the best way to say that. Did you find choosing to go the path of being a writer, did you find yourself butting your head up against those expectations? I had to ask.
I'm glad you asked. And I'll tell a joke that I often tell, and you might have heard this before, that in a Nigerian family, there are four career options. You either become a doctor, or you become a
Mm-hmm.
lawyer, or you become an engineer, or
Mm-hmm.
you become a disgrace to your family. Those are your options. Um, so, I mean, for me, I think I was very fortunate. My mom was very supportive. You know,
Mm.
um, she's a big reader. She reads a lot. So I think that sort of made her inclined, to support me.
And mothers play a really big role in this new novel of yours
Mm,
as well. I mean, there's a few, obviously marriage is a big topic of conversation in
mm,
this book, and marriage as a vehicle,
mm,
not in a romantic sense, but as a
mm,
vehicle,
mm,
um, a vehicle for stability. But mothers, these, who is, who isn't, who
mm,
decides to be, what
mm,
that means, what the
mm,
responsibilities of motherhood are.
mm,
Um, why was that a theme that you were
mm.
attracted to?
Yeah. I mean, I think I was saying to someone the other day that I'm very, very interested in Nigerian women of a certain age, say from 55 to 65. And I'm
Mm,
very interested in how they reconcile the contradictions of their lives, you know.
mm,
Um, because I mean, I've been around a lot of them. My mom has four sisters, so I grew up around a lot of aunties. And they're always more complicated than they present themselves to be. They're always more complex than
hmm
they allow themselves to be seen. So for me, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this mothers, to really drill down into um, how complex they are as characters, and to give you a sense of what they might seem like on the surface. And then you
hmm
really go into their own perspective and you have another sense of how they see their lives, and how they think about the compromises that they've made, or the choices that they've made of their life. And that's why, the structure of this novel, I feel, is very useful in that sense, that you get to see these characters from the perspective of, say, their children. You can see their
Yeah.
children looking at them and having opinions about who they are. And then you get to them and then you see, how they've come to become the women that they are, and how for some of them, this really was the only viable path that was available to them, and
hmm
maybe you live with some compassion, for their place in the world, even if you don't necessarily agree with the choices that they've made. So that was important to me. The other thing that I always sort of wanted to write about was just how I think that in many families, they are the ones who anchor the families. You know,
hmm
they are the real anchors. And I wanted
hmm
to honor that in the structure with which this novel, is told.
Yeah. That's abundantly clear here. And I want to talk more about that. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Ayobami Adebayo and Writing Black.
Introducing Dear Culture with Panama Jackson on the theGrio Black Podcast Network. Bring your friends for the shenanigans and stay for the edutainment as Panama debates culture wars, Janet Jackson versus Michael, Black fashions, Black mendations, and everything Black. Listen today on the theGrio mobile app for all the Black culture conversations you don't want to miss. Also available wherever great podcasts are heard.
And we are back to continue our discussion on A Spell of Good Things, which is the forthcoming book from Ayobami Adebayo. We were just talking about mothers and how they're the anchors of many of these families, and I think that's true globally, really. But, in these families, especially, one of the things that, and I love what you were saying actually about perspectives, and structure. You read books or even collections of short stories where maybe the narratives intersect and
Mm,
people are telling different stories or the same story from different perspectives. But this was a very effective structural choice, right? Where we're getting, even though you're talking about these characters in third person, we're getting this, it's like an ever-shifting lens. And I don't know that it's an easy one to execute. So talk to me about how you decided on this structure and how you made this work for you. I know this was a 10-year process, so I imagine it wasn't easy. But I would love to hear about, like, how does that, like, from a process standpoint, how are you just picking a different character to focus on from time to time? Like, how does that work?
Before I answer that, can I just say that I'm really loving this conversation?
Of course you can.
I really am.
Loving it too.
And I think that's one of the things that's so important about this podcast, is that you get to talk about process. Because, as I'm sure you know, sometimes the questions you get are not about process.
Right, that's true. That's true.
So I'm really happy to talk about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So with structure, I tend to feel my way into the right structure. I hope that changes because, I hope it gets easier. But I think that with this book, for instance, I began with just two perspectives, So the first draft was going back and forth between two characters. So there was Eniola, and then the main character in the first draft was the younger sister from the other family, Okay. So it was a very different book. And at some point I realized she couldn't carry the weight of our family's
she is fascinating, though.
Yeah, I really like her.
Yes.
I really like her. So I started out with two people of about the same age, as being just the two of them in the whole novel. And then by the time I got to the second draft, I realized, this is not the person, for this other half of the story. And then I went for the elder sister. And then by the time I was done with that draft, I looked at it and I said, I need to look at, I think this would be more effective if I'm looking at this part of the story from the perspective of other characters. So I wish I could answer by saying that I had a master plan from the beginning, but I just write my way into structure, really. For some reason, I tend to end up with books that, even if I say so, tend to end up being pretty well structured. But I think it's really just repeating over and over again. And then I think the key for me is really the characters. Once I'm very clear about who they are and I've teased out enough about them, I know exactly who should tell what part of the story,
and how they would respond to that part
and
of the story.
how they would respond, So the key is always the character. But generally, in my experience so far, I tend to fail into it. So I start thinking, this is the structure, and then I'm like, no, this doesn't work. And then I keep, tweaking it until I get to something that I feel, this is it now.
I don't know if you should aim for that to change. I think, first of all, I don't think there's any wrong answers when it comes to writing. There's wrong writing, I guess, but I think the process itself, one of the reasons I'm so interested in process and interested in each writer's process is because I know it's different. And I think, because we all think differently, we all learn differently, we all process things differently. That to me is a great answer. I think, and I think this idea of leading with the characters is a great answer too, because I think like character development is that's really what draws us in. That's what gets us attached to a narrative. I want to talk about some of the other bits of humanity and research that you teased out here. I'm going to take a quick break, but we'll be back in just a moment with more Writing Black.
The GRIO Black Podcast Network is here, and it's everything you've been waiting for. News, talk, entertainment, sports, and today's issues, all from the Black perspective. Ready for real talk and Black culture amplified? Be inspired. Listen to new and established voices now on the GRIO Black Podcast Network. Listen today on the Grio mobile app and tune in everywhere great podcasts are heard.
All right, Ayobami. We're just talking about your process and character development, and you weave in some very this is a work of fiction, but obviously what makes these characters, I think, so relatable and so. I mean, you really do get attached. You care what happens to them, and I think that this is true of any good book in which you get attached. Is that you've teased out something in them that feels deeply relatable. One of the things that's really striking to me in A Spell of Good Things is how you handle depression. This discussion of somebody going through a mental health crisis that the people around him are not necessarily equipped to understand from multiple levels, right? Is that reflective? Did you feel that was like culturally reflective? I know, like, from a Black American perspective, we talk about the obstacles to mental health, right? In our communities, and that we don't discuss it enough. I mean, that's like an ongoing thing here. And this felt very culturally linked as well in terms of how people were responding to this character's crisis. But I thought you handled it so well. Like, how did you hope to approach that, and why was it such a key part of this narrative?
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree with your read of it. I think it's definitely culturally linked. I think that there's still a lot of progress to be made in terms of how we interact, with people when they're having a mental health issue, a mental health crisis. I think that there isn't as much awareness or as much grace as if someone was having a physical health issue, for instance.
Right.
And with this one in particular, it was a little personal. So there was this thing that happened in my home state in Nigeria in the early 2000s, in the year 2000 actually, where teachers were just retrenched. A whole generation of teachers were retrenched overnight, literally. And one of my friends at the time,
Meaning they were fired. For people who
they were
aren't
fired.
they
were just
people
fired.
who are not familiar with that term.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they were just fired, and there were all kinds of political reasons why that happened. And for me, so there was a friend that I had at the time. We were in secondary school, and our mother was one of the teachers who was fired. And she went into a depressive episode that lasted a few years after that. And I could see that impact on my friend, over time. And I really wanted to think about it with this book. And this is something that happened in 2000. This is now 2023. I'm also very interested, in all the policy tragedies that are forgotten, It's a small state in Nigeria. Most people don't remember that this happened. But I'm very interested in what that means, for the people that were affected directly and intimately by it.
I love that answer, and I think it's so relatable, again, to so many of us. As somebody who is, had my own experiences with anxiety, depression, that was the way that you teased that out. I felt was so effective and so true. It was so true, like the way that manifests. We're going to talk a little bit more. I think that I want to talk a little bit more about the politics when we come back. So we're going to take a quick final break, and we'll be back with more Writing Black. All right. Ayobami Adebayo and her book, A Spell of Good Things, is what we are discussing today on Writing Black. This is your second novel, which By the way, congratulations. That's not a small
Thank
thing.
you.
We were just talking about, like, policies and how people have a short memory when it comes to policies. And there's also obviously this political component of your book. There's this, there of the many plots that are intersecting and intertwining here, and these ways that people are affecting each other in ways that they couldn't even know. You have this political plot going on.
Carol was angry. After one of her apprentices read the notice of the meeting out loud to her, she threw it across the room into a dustbin. Some politician's wife wanted to give a talk to the Tailoring Association, and their president had agreed to welcome the woman during their next meeting. And, of course, the president thought it meant something to mention that this politician's wife was the daughter of a tailor. Carol was almost sure this was a lie. Those people would claim to be your kinsmen if it would help them get into power.
And there's like a bit of intrigue there. And all political systems are loaded all across the world. What were you trying to tell us a little bit about the one that you grew up in?
I mean, I think one of the reasons why I write about particular things, sometimes I write about the things that I'm most perplexed by, that I don't get it, the things that I'm frustrated by, and writing is sometimes a coping process for me, or that I bring it into, I guess, a space that I have some control over. So I think that with the politics in this book, I think I was just trying to think through the injustice of it all, and how, in my opinion, I don't think anybody can insulate themselves against the consequences of building a society in this way. I think that what many people have as a result of the class that they are in is an illusion of insulation, and I think he was, and I think he was, there's this thing about middle class Nigerians, which, again, everything good will come by Sefiata. I think she got that class of people right, or which is the sense that the response, is often there's insecurity, you build a higher fence, there's no water, you drill a bowl, there's no light, you buy your generator, and you sort of insulate yourself a little bit from the extremes of things that are going on. But I feel that it's a bit of an illusion, and the earlier we all realize that, the better, so that's, for me, what's at the heart of some of the politics that plays out in the book. It's to look at that community and how they have a collective destiny, even if they don't all realize it, they don't realize it yet.
That is, first of all, I love it when I talk to writers and you can tell that they're writers by the way that they talk. You're so poetic in the way that you put these things. And I think that's true for middle class people around the world. I really do.
Yeah.
This sense of having, like, made it but being insecure. I think that's that tenuousness of existence. That tenuousness of whatever we think security is, and how that's even that is a constantly moving goalpost. I think is really, really striking. One of the things that inspired this podcast was, that I don't think since, the Black Arts Movement, or maybe the Harlem Renaissance, obviously, but that there's been a more exciting time to be a Black writer. There's in terms of there being platforms deliberately created for us, more receptivity to what we have to say, for better or worse in some aspects. And, we were speaking earlier about how there also seems to have finally been this openness for I think, a transatlantic conversation that has not been happening as frequently as it should, that I find particularly as an African American, so to speak, I find particularly exciting. Is that excitement shared, in Nigeria or West Africa or in the circles that you're traveling in your country? Is there that same sense of, oh, look, we're gaining some ground here in terms of our perspectives, or is this just one of those other cases where we're just getting turned on to something that's been there the whole time?
I think it is. I think definitely that excitement is shared. And I mean, I love what you said about the transatlantic conversations, that are happening. And for me as a reader, and also as a writer, I'm very, very interested in that opening up more and more and more. Um,
Yeah.
for the continent, for all of its diaspora expressions, I think that we need to
Yeah.
be talking to each other. I think it's very essential, for us as a people. Um, I mean, in
Yeah.
terms of, say, Nigeria in particular, I think that the last decade and some have been they've just been so important in terms of the kinds of books that have been coming out. Um,
Yeah.
and it's just an exciting time. Again, I'm speaking as a reader, first of
Yeah.
all,
Yeah. I agree.
I'm
Yeah.
seeing all the books that I really want to read now.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, when I talk about that, I think there's so much that we still don't understand about each other. I love, like, the reason I use the term transatlantic conversations, like, sometimes you'll catch these back and forths on social media, like on Twitter, and it's like, it's so clear how much we don't understand about each other, how much we might, inherently resent or just,
Mm,
it's, and I love the way that books in particular open up that conversation and open up that
mm,
pathway for understanding, or just better, or empathy. I'm big on empathy, so that's always a really big thing for me. And we will be right back with more Writing Black. All right, welcome back to Writing Black. So we were talking about this being a very exciting time to be a writer. And, I'm looking forward to us all feeling like we're part of the diaspora in a more
mm,
integrated way. But who do you read? Who do you read? Who
mm.
excites you? And who do you think we should be reading?
Ah, um, um, so I mean, most recently, um, in thinking about, where we just left off the conversation, I remember
Mm-hmm.
reading Ongoing, by
But
Jesse.
yeah, Jossie, yes, I love that
Yeah,
book.
I
Yes,
really love that book. I mean, it's so
yes.
good.
Yes.
It's so
Actually,
good. It
it's
was,
so funny because Transcendent Kingdom, which I
hmm
think is her second novel,
yeah, it's a
there were
second
some
novel.
parallels there. I was thinking about that book when I was reading yours,
Yeah.
in terms of the amount of research you clearly did, the medical research to put into this book. And I was thinking, like, wow, do you just like pull that out of like, how do you even find that out? Like some of these terms and like, what you should be reading and,
Yeah. So that's someone whose work is very important to me. I mean, I'm going
hmm
with that book I was telling everybody, you have to read this, you have to read this, you
Yes.
have to read this.
Yes, Homecoming by
Um,
Yajasi, absolutely. Yes.
Absolutely. Also most recently, Brit Bennett.
Okay.
Really love the novels. And I really love Sefiata's novels. To answer the question of who should we be reading, she's one Nigerian novelist that I wish more people were reading.
Give the name again,
Sefi
just so I can.
Atta.
Okay.
So
Okay.
our first novel is
Fabulous.
called Everything Good Will Come.
Yes. Okay. So the
It's a
book
really
you were
good
referring
book.
to earlier. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, those are the three that come to mind immediately now.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get off this call and remember like 20 other people that I should have mentioned.
Well,
Uh,
you can email them, and we will tell our listeners and our fellow readers exactly what they should be listening to.
Absolutely,
I will happily add them to our book guides,
I will.
because
I
as
will
we've
send
noted,
them.
this is an important transatlantic conversation that should be ongoing.
Yeah.
And, obviously this is your second novel, which, in and of itself is a tremendous feat. You said these take a long time for you to tease out, but are there other ideas already percolating for what's next? I have to
Um,
ask.
yeah. Yes, actually. I have a couple of ideas. I'm trying to settle in on something.
Okay. Well, in the
Hopefully
meantime,
before the
enjoy this one. And I hope the
yes.
response is as tremendous as your first, if not bigger.
Thank you.
And, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Ayobami. For our listeners, that's Ayobami Adebayo. The new book is A Spell of Good Things, and it is out February 7th. Highly recommend. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation as well. So thank you for joining us on Writing Black.
Thank you so much. I had a really good time. Thank
Good.
you.
I love hearing that. And we'll see the rest of you next week. Now, this is the part of the podcast where I talk to you about some of my favorite books, with a little segment we like to call My Favorites. And, in honor of Ayobami, I just want to say, like, the writers who are coming out right now from across the African continent are really special. But there's another Nigerian writer that I really, really love. Akwake Emeze is a tremendous writer. They are, writing across genres. There's been children's books and I believe some poetry, fiction, nonfiction. This memoir, Dear Sandrine, a Black Spirit memoir, is really, really gripping and fascinating, and just, it took me out. So I highly recommend getting into Emeze's work. Yajasi, as Ayobami noted, is also an incredible writer. Ya is Ghanaian American, a first gen, and her work really takes us back and forth from her Ghanaian roots to here in America, and she really, I think, taps into that experience of being first gen in a really poignant way. Her writing is just incredible. It is transcendent, and her second novel is Transcendent Kingdom, which I also recommend. Now, the third book I'm going to recommend is not by an African writer, but it's really a fantastic effort, and this is by Catherine E. McKinley. It's the African Lookbook. Now, some of you might know I'm also the lifestyle editor here at theGrio, so I love books, I love aesthetics, I love all things, I love fashion. And this is a visual history of over 100 years of African women. And this is, having spoken to Catherine, she runs the McKinley Collection, which is one of the, I think, biggest collections of original African photography. And one of the things I love is that it really draws us out of this colonialist narrative that people have about Africa, and really shows African women as the arbiters of style and class and distinction that they are and have been for generations. So if you love a good picture book, a little coffee table read, I highly recommend the African Lookbook. And that's it for this week. We will also be putting out a guide of other African authors you should get into. So stay on the lookout for that as we continue Africa Amplified. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode of Writing Black. As always, you can find us on the Grio app or wherever you find your podcasts.